Chapter 1. New World Beginnings. Several billion years ago, that whirling speck of cosmic dust known as the Earth, fifth in size among the planets, came into being. About 6,000 years ago, only a minute in geological time, recorded history of the Western world began. Certain peoples of the Middle East, developing a written culture, gradually emerged from the haze of the past. 500 years ago, only a few seconds figuratively speaking, European explorers stumbled on the Americas. This dramatic accident forever altered the future of both the Old World and the New, and of Africa and Asia as well. Planet Earth took on its present form slowly. Some 225 million years ago, a single supercontinent, called Pangaea by geologists, contained all the world's dry land. Then, enormous chunks of terrain began to drift away from this colossal landmass, opening the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, narrowing the Pacific Ocean, and forming the great continents of Eurasia, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, and the Americas. The existence of a single original continent has been proved in part by the discovery of nearly identical species of fish that swim today in long separated freshwater lakes throughout the world. Continued shifting and folding of the Earth's crust thrust up mountain ranges. The Appalachians were probably formed even before continental separation, perhaps 350 million years ago. The majestic ranges of western North America, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, and the Coast Ranges arose much more recently, geologically speaking, some 135 million to 25 million years ago. They are truly American mountains, born after the continent took on its own separate geological identity. By about 10 million years ago, nature had sculpted the basic geological shape of North America. The continent was anchored in its northeastern corner by the massive Canadian Shield, a zone undergirded by ancient rock, probably the first part of what became the North American landmass to have emerged above sea level. A narrow eastern coastal plain or tidewater region, creased by many river valleys, sloped gently upward to the time-worn ridges of the Appalachians. Those ancient mountains slanted away on their western side into the huge mid-continental basin that rolled downward to the Mississippi Valley bottom, and then rose relentlessly to the towering peaks of the Rockies. From the Rocky Mountain crest, the roof of America, the land fell off jaggedly into the intermountain Great Basin, bounded by the Rockies on the east and the Sierra and Cascade Ranges on the west. The valleys of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers and the Willamette-Puget Sound Trough seemed the interiors of present-day California, Oregon, and Washington. The land at last met the foaming Pacific, where the coast ranges rose steeply from the sea. Nature laid a chill hand over much of this terrain in the Great Ice Age, beginning about 2 million years ago. 2-mile-thick ice sheets crept from the polar regions to blanket parts of Europe, Asia, and the Americas. In North America, the great glaciers carpeted most of present-day Canada and the United States as far southward as a line stretching from Pennsylvania through the Ohio country and the Dakotas to the Pacific Northwest. When the glaciers finally retreated about 10,000 years ago, they left the North American landscape transformed and much as we know it today. The weight of the gargantuan ice mantle had depressed the level of the Canadian Shield. The grinding and flushing action of the moving and melting ice had scoured away the shield's topsoil, pitted its rocky surface with thousands of shallow depressions into which the melting glaciers flowed to form lakes. The same glacial action scooped out and filled the Great Lakes. They originally drained southward through the Mississippi River system to the Gulf of Mexico. When the melting ice unblocked the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the lake water sought the St. Lawrence River outlet to the Atlantic Ocean, lowering the Great Lakes level and leaving the Missouri, Mississippi, Ohio system to drain the enormous mid-continental basin between the Appalachians and the Rockies. Similarly, in the west, water from the melting glaciers filled sprawling Lake Bonneville, covering much of present-day Utah, Nevada, and Idaho. It drained to the Pacific Ocean through the Snake and Columbia River systems until diminishing rainfall from the ebbing ice cap lowered the water level, cutting off access to the Snake River outlet. Deprived of both inflow and drainage, the giant lake became a gradually shrinking inland sea. It grew increasingly saline, slowly evaporated, and left an arid, mineral-rich desert. Only the Great Salt Lake remains as a relic of Bonneville's former vastness. Today, Lake Bonneville's ancient beaches are visible on mountainsides up to 1,000 feet above the dry floor of the Great Basin. The Great Ice Age shaped more than the geological history of North America. It also contributed to the origins of the continent's human history. Though recent, and still highly controversial, evidence suggests that some early people may have reached the Americas in crude boats. Most probably came by land. Some 35,000 years ago, the Ice Age congealed much of the world's oceans into massive ice pack glaciers, lowering the level of the sea. As the sea level dropped, it exposed a land bridge connecting Eurasia with North America in the area of the present-day Bering Sea, between Siberia and Alaska. Across that bridge, probably following migratory herds of game, ventured small bands of nomadic Asian hunters, the immigrant ancestors of the Native Americans. They continued to trek across the Bering Isthmus for some 250 centuries, slowly peopling the American continents. As the Ice Age ended and the glaciers melted, the sea level rose again, inundating the land bridge about 10,000 years ago. Nature thus barred the door to further immigration for many thousands of years, leaving this part of the human family marooned for millennia on the now isolated American continents. Time did not stand still for these original Americans. The same climatic warming that melted the ice and drowned the bridge to Eurasia gradually opened ice-free valleys through which vanguard bands groped their way southward and eastward across the Americas. Roaming slowly through this awesome wilderness, they eventually reached the far tip of South America, some 15,000 miles from Siberia. By the time Europeans arrived in America in 1492, perhaps 54 million people inhabited the two American continents. Over the centuries, they split into countless tribes, evolved more than 2,000 separate languages, and developed many diverse religions, cultures, and ways of life. Incas in Peru, Mayans in Central America, and Aztecs in Mexico shaped stunningly sophisticated civilizations. Their advanced agricultural practices, based primarily on the cultivation of maize, which is Indian corn, fed large populations, perhaps as many as 20 million in Mexico alone. Although without large draft animals such as horses and oxen and lacking even the simple technology of the wheel, these peoples built elaborate cities and carried on far-flung commerce. Talented mathematicians, they made strikingly accurate astronomical observations. The Aztecs also routinely sought the favor of their gods by offering human sacrifices, cutting the hearts out of the chests of living victims, who were often captives conquered in battle. By some accounts, more than 5,000 people were ritually slaughtered to celebrate the crowning of one Aztec chieftain. Agriculture, especially corn growing, accounted for the size and sophistication of the Native American civilizations in Mexico and South America. About 5,000 BCE, hunter-gatherers in highland Mexico developed a wild grass into the staple crop of corn, which became their staff of life and the foundation of the complex, large-scale civilized Aztec and Incan civilizations that eventually emerged. Cultivation of corn spread across the Americas from the Mexican heartland. Everywhere it was planted, corn began to transform nomadic hunting bands into settled agricultural villagers. But this process went forward slowly and unevenly. Corn planting reached the present-day American Southwest as early as 2000 BCE and powerfully molded Pueblo culture. The Pueblo peoples in the Rio Grande Valley constructed intricate irrigation systems to water their cornfields. They were dwelling in villages of multi-storied, terraced buildings when Spanish explorers made contact with them in the 16th century. Pueblo means village in Spanish. Corn cultivation reached other parts of North America considerably later. The timing of its arrival in different localities explains much about the relative rates of development in different Native American peoples. Throughout the continent, to the north and east of the land of the Pueblos, social life was less elaborately developed. Indeed, societies in the modern sense of the word scarcely existed. No dense concentrations of population or complex nation-states comparable to the Aztec Empire existed in North America, outside of Mexico at the time of the Europeans' arrival. One of the reasons for the relative ease with which the European colonizers subdued the native North Americans. The mound builders of the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippian culture of the lower Midwest, and the desert-dwelling Anasazi peoples of the Southwest did sustain some large settlements after the incorporation of corn planting into their ways of life during the first millennium CE. The Mississippian settlement at Cahokia, near present-day East St. Louis, was at one time home to as many as 25,000 people. The Anasazis built an elaborate pueblo of more than 600 interconnected rooms at Chaco Canyon in modern-day New Mexico. But mysteriously, perhaps due to prolonged drought, all those ancient cultures fell into decline by about 1300 CE. The cultivation of maize, as well as of high-yielding strains of beans and squash, reached the southeastern Atlantic seaboard region of North America about 1000 CE. These plants made possible three-sister farming, with beans growing on the trellis of the corn stalks and squash covering the planting mounds to retain moisture in the soil. The rich diet provided by this environmentally clever farming technique produced some of the highest population densities on the continent, among them the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee peoples. The Iroquois in the northeastern woodlands, inspired by a legendary leader named Hiawatha, created in the 16th century perhaps the closest North American approximation to the great empires of Mexico and Peru. The Iroquois Confederacy developed the political and organizational skills to sustain a robust military alliance that menaced its neighbors, Native American and European alike, for well over a century. But for the most part, the native peoples of North America were living in small, scattered, and impermanent settlements on the eve of the Europeans' arrival. In more settled agricultural groups, women tended the crops while men hunted, fished, gathered fuel, and cleared fields for planting. This pattern of life frequently conferred substantial authority on women. And many North American native peoples, including the Iroquois, developed matrilineal cultures in which power and possessions passed down the female side of the family line. Unlike the Europeans, who would soon arrive with the presumption that humans had dominion over the earth, and with the technologies to alter the very face of the land, the Native Americans had neither the desire nor the means to manipulate nature aggressively. They revered the physical world and endowed nature with spiritual properties. Yet they did sometimes ignite massive forest fires, deliberately torching thousands of acres of trees to create better hunting habitats, especially for deer. This practice accounted for the open, park-like appearance of the eastern woodlands that so amazed early European explorers. But in a broad sense, the land did not feel the hand of the Native Americans heavy upon it, partly because they were so few in number. They were so thinly spread across the continent that vast areas were virtually untouched by a human presence. In the fateful year 1492, probably no more than 4 million Native Americans padded through the whispering primeval forests and paddled across the sparkling virgin waters of the continent north of Mexico. They were blissfully unaware that the historic isolation of the Americas was about to end forever, as the land and the native peoples alike felt the full shock of the European discovery. Europeans, for their part, were equally unaware of the existence of the Americas. Blonde-bearded Norse seafarers from Scandinavia had chanced upon the northeastern shoulder of North America about 1000 CE. They landed at a place near L'Anse aux Meadows, in present-day Newfoundland, that abounded in wild grapes, which led them to name the spot Vinland. But no strong nation-state, yearning to expand, supported these venturesome voyagers. Their flimsy settlements, consequently, were soon abandoned, and their discovery was forgotten, except in Scandinavian saga and song. For several centuries thereafter, other restless Europeans, with the growing power of ambitious governments behind them, sought contact with a wider world, whether for conquest or trade. They thus set in motion the chain of events that led to a drive toward Asia, the penetration of Africa, and the completely accidental discovery of the New World. Christian crusaders must rank high among America's indirect discoverers. Clad in shining armor, tens of thousands of these European warriors tried from the 11th to the 14th centuries to wrest the Holy Land from Muslim control. Foiled in their military assaults, the Crusaders nevertheless acquired a taste for the exotic delights of Asia. Goods that had been virtually unknown in Europe now were craved. Silk for clothing, drugs for aching flesh, perfumes for unbathed bodies, colorful draperies for gloomy castles, and spices, especially sugar, a rare luxury in Europe before the Crusades, for preserving and flavoring food. Europe's developing sweet tooth would have momentous implications for world history. The luxuries of the East were prohibitively expensive in Europe. They had to be transported enormous distances from the Spice Islands, Indonesia, China, and India, in creaking ships and on swaying camelback. The journey led across the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea, or along the tortuous caravan routes of Asia or the Arabian Peninsula, ending at the ports of the eastern Mediterranean. Muslim middlemen exacted a heavy toll en route. By the time the strange-smelling goods reached Italian merchants at Venice and Genoa, they were so costly that purchasers and profits alike were narrowly limited. European consumers and distributors were naturally eager to find a less expensive route to the riches of Asia, or to develop alternate sources of supply. European appetites were further whetted when footloose Marco Polo, an Italian adventurer, returned to Europe in 1295 and began telling tales of his nearly 20-year sojourn in China. Though he may in fact never have seen China, legend to the contrary, the hard evidence is sketchy. He must be regarded as an indirect discoverer of the New World, for his book, with its descriptions of rose-tinted pearls and golden pagodas, stimulated European desires for a cheaper route to the treasures of the East. These accumulating pressures eventually brought a breakthrough for European expansion. Before the middle of the 15th century, European sailors refused to sail southward along the coast of West Africa because they could not beat their way home against the prevailing northerly winds and south-flowing currents. About 1450, Portuguese mariners overcame those obstacles. Not only had they developed the caravel, a ship that could sail more closely to the wind, but they had discovered that they could return to Europe by sailing northwesterly from the African coast toward the Azores, where the prevailing westward breezes would carry them home. The new world of sub-Saharan Africa now came within the grasp of questing Europeans. The northern shore of Africa, as part of the Mediterranean world, had been known to Europe since antiquity. But because sea travel down the African coast had been virtually impossible, Africa south of the forbidding Sahara Desert barrier had remained remote and mysterious. African gold, perhaps 2/3 of Europe's supply, crossed the Sahara on camelback, and shadowy tales may have reached Europe about the flourishing West African kingdom of Mali in the Niger River Valley, with its impressive Islamic university at Timbuktu. But Europeans had no direct access to sub-Saharan Africa until the Portuguese navigators began to creep down the West African coast in the middle of the 15th century. The Portuguese promptly set up trading posts along the African shore for the purchase of gold and slaves. Arab flesh merchants and Africans themselves had traded slaves for centuries before the Europeans arrived. The slavers routinely charged higher prices for captives from distant sources because they could not easily flee to their native villages or be easily rescued by their kin. Slave brokers also deliberately separated persons from the same tribes and mixed unlike people together to frustrate organized resistance. Thus, from its earliest days, slavery by its very nature disrupted African communities and inhabited the expression of regional African cultures and tribal identities. The Portuguese adopted these Arab and African practices. They built up their own systematic traffic in slaves to work the sugar plantations that Portugal and later Spain established on the African coastal islands of Madeira, the Canaries, São Tomé, and Príncipe. The enormous Portuguese appetite for slaves dwarfed the modest scale of the pre-European traffic. Slave trading became a big business. Some 40,000 Africans were carried away to the Atlantic sugar islands in the last half of the 15th century. Millions more were to be wrenched from their home continent after the discovery of the Americas. In these 15th century Portuguese adventures in Africa were to be found the origins of the modern plantation system, based on large-scale commercial agriculture and the wholesale exploitation of slave labor. This kind of plantation economy would shape the destiny of much of the New World. The seafaring Portuguese pushed still farther southward in search of the water route to Asia. Edging cautiously down the African coast, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the southernmost tip of the Dark Continent in 1488. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama finally reached India, hence the name Indies, given by Europeans to all the mysterious lands of the Orient, and returned home with a small but tantalizing cargo of jewels and spices. Meanwhile, the Kingdom of Spain became unified, an event pregnant with destiny, in the late 15th century. This new unity resulted primarily from the marriage of two sovereigns, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, and from the brutal expulsion of the infidel Muslim Moors from Spain after centuries of Christian Islamic warfare. Glorifying in their sudden strength, the Spaniards were eager to outstrip their Portuguese rivals in the race to tap the wealth of the Indies. To the south and east, Portugal controlled the African coast and thus the gateway to the round Africa water route to India. Of necessity, therefore, Spain looked westward. The stage was now set for a cataclysmic shift in the course of history, the history not only of Europe, but of all the world. Europeans clamored for more and cheaper products from the lands beyond the Mediterranean. Africa had been established as a source of abundant slave labor for plantation agriculture. The Portuguese voyages had demonstrated the feasibility of long-range ocean navigation. In Spain, a modern national state was taking place, with the unity, wealth, and power to shoulder the formidable tasks of discovery, conquest, and colonization. The dawn of the Renaissance in the 14th century nurtured an ambitious spirit of optimism and adventure. Printing presses, introduced about 1450, facilitated the spread of scientific knowledge. The mariner's compass, possibly borrowed from the Arabs, eliminated some of the uncertainties of sea travel. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the unsuspecting New World innocently awaited its European discoverers. Onto this stage stepped Christopher Columbus. This skilled Italian seafarer persuaded the Spanish monarchs to outfit him with 3 tiny but seaworthy ships, manned by a motley crew. Daringly, he unfurled the sails of his cockleshell craft and headed westward. His superstitious sailors, fearful of venturing into the oceanic unknown, grew increasingly mutinous. After 6 weeks at sea, failure loomed until, on October 12, 1492, the crew sighted an island in the Bahamas. A new world thus swam within the vision of Europeans. Columbus's sensational achievement obscures the fact that he was one of the most successful failures in history. Seeking a new water route to the fabled Indies, he in fact had bumped into an enormous land barrier blocking the ocean pathway. For decades thereafter, explorers strove to get through it or around it. The truth gradually dawned that sprawling new continents had been discovered. Yet Columbus was at first so certain that he had skirted the rim of the Indies that he called the native peoples Indians, a gross geographical misnomer that somehow stuck. Columbus's discovery would eventually convulse 4 continents: Europe, Africa, and the 2 Americas. Thanks to his epical journey, an independent global economic system emerged on a scale undreamed of before he set sail. Its workings touched every shore washed by the Atlantic Ocean. Europe provided the markets, the capital, and the technology. Africa furnished the labor, and the New World offered its raw materials, especially its precious metals and its soil for the cultivation of sugarcane. For Europeans as well as for Africans and Native Americans, the world after 1492 would never be the same, for better or worse. Two ecosystems, the fragile, naturally evolved networks of relations among organizations in a stable environment, commingled and clashed when Columbus waded ashore. The reverberations from that historic encounter, often called the Columbian Exchange, echoed for centuries after 1492. The flora and fauna, as well as the peoples of the Old and New Worlds, had been separated for thousands of years. European explorers marveled at the strange sights that greeted them, including exotic beasts such as iguanas and snakes with castanets, rattlesnakes. Native New World plants such as tobacco, maize, beans, tomatoes, and especially the lowly potato eventually revolutionized the international economy as well as the European diet, feeding the rapid population growth of the Old World. These foodstuffs were among the most important Indian gifts to the Europeans and to the rest of the world. Perhaps 3/5 of the crops cultivated around the globe today originated in the Americas. Ironically, the introduction into Africa of New World foodstuffs like maize, manioc, and sweet potatoes may have led an African population boom that numerically, though not morally, more than offset the losses inflicted by the slave trade. In exchange, the Europeans introduced Old World crops and animals to the Americas. Columbus returned to the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in 1493 with 17 ships that unloaded 1,200 men and a virtual Noah's Ark of cattle, swine, and horses. The horses soon reached the North American mainland through Mexico. Over the next 2 centuries, they spread as far as Canada. Southwestern Indian tribes like the Comanche, Apache, and Navajo swiftly adopted the horse. Northern tribes like the Lakota, Shoshone, and Blackfeet somewhat later. Horses transformed newly mounted cultures into highly mobile, wide-ranging hunter-warrior societies that roamed the grassy Great Plains in pursuit of the shaggy buffalo, and that suppressed unmounted peoples like the Paiute. Columbus also brought seedlings of sugarcane, which thrived in the warm Caribbean climate. A sugar revolution consequently took place in the European diet, fueled by the forced migration of millions of Africans to work the cane fields and sugar mills of the New World. Unwittingly, the Europeans also brought other organisms in the dirt on their boots and the dust on their clothes, such as the seeds of Kentucky bluegrass, dandelions, and daisies. Most ominous of all, in their bodies they carried the germs that caused smallpox, yellow fever, and malaria. Old World diseases quickly devastated the Native Americans. During the Indians' millennia of isolation in the Americas, most of the Old World's killer maladies had disappeared from among them. But generations of freedom from those illnesses had also wiped out protective antibodies. Devoid of natural resistance to Old World sicknesses, Indians died in droves. Within 50 years of the Spanish arrival, the population of the Taino natives in Hispaniola dwindled from some 1 million people to about 200. Enslavement and armed aggression took their toll, but the deadliest killers were microbes, not muskets. The lethal germs spread among the New World peoples with the speed and force of a hurricane, swiftly sweeping far ahead of the human invaders. Most of those afflicted never laid eyes on a European. In the centuries after Columbus's landfall, as many as 90% of the Native Americans perished, a demographic catastrophe without parallel in human history. This depopulation was surely not intended by the Spanish, but it was nevertheless so severe that entire cultures and ancient ways of life were extinguished forever. Baffled, enraged, and vengeful, Indian slaves sometimes kneaded tainted blood into their masters' bread, to little effect. Perhaps it was poetic justice that the Indians unintentionally did take a kind of revenge by inflicting the early explorers with syphilis, injecting that lethal, sexually transmitted disease for the first time into Europe. Gradually, Europeans realized that the American continent held rich prizes, especially the gold and silver of the advanced Indian civilizations in Mexico and Peru. Spain secured its claim to Columbus's discovery in the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing with Portugal the heathen lands of the New World. The lion's share went to Spain, but Portugal received compensating territory in Africa and Asia, as well as title to lands that one day would be Brazil. The islands of the Caribbean Sea, the West Indies as they came to be called, and yet another perpetuation of Columbus's geographic confusion, served as offshore bases for staging the Spanish invasion of the mainland Americas. Here supplies could be stored, and men and horses could be rested and acclimated before proceeding to the conquest of the continents. The loosely organized and vulnerable native communities of the West Indies also provided laboratories for testing the techniques that would eventually subdue the advanced Indian civilizations of Mexico and Peru. The most important such technique was the institution known as the encomienda. It allowed the government to commend, or give, Indians to certain colonists in return for the promise to try to Christianize them. In all but name, it was slavery. Spanish missionary Bartolomé de las Casas, appalled by the encomienda system in Hispaniola, called it a moral pestilence invented by Satan. In 1519, Hernán Cortés set sail from Cuba with 16 fresh horses and several hundred men aboard 11 ships, bound for Mexico and for destiny. On the island of Cozumel, off the Yucatan Peninsula, he rescued a Spanish castaway who had been enslaved for several years by the Mayan-speaking Indians. A short distance farther on, he picked up the female Indian slave Malinche, who knew both Mayan and Nahuatl, the language of the powerful Aztec rulers of the great empire in the highlands of central Mexico. In addition to his superior firepower, Cortés now had the advantage, through these two interpreters, of understanding the speech of the native peoples, whom he was about to encounter, including the Aztecs. Malinche eventually learned Spanish and was baptized with the Spanish name of Doña Marina. Near present-day Veracruz, Cortés made his final landfall. Through his interpreters he learned of unrest within the Aztec Empire among the peoples from whom the Aztecs demanded tribute. He also heard alluring tales of the gold and other wealth stored up in the legendary Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. He lusted to tear open the coffers of the Aztec kingdom. To quell his mutinous troops, he boldly burned his ships, cutting off any hope of retreat. Gathering a force of some 20,000 Indian allies, he marched on Tenochtitlan and toward one of history's most dramatic and fateful encounters. As Cortés proceeded, the Aztec chieftain Moctezuma sent ambassadors bearing fabulous gifts to welcome the approaching Spaniards. These only whetted the conquistadors' appetite. "We Spanish suffer from a strange disease of the heart," Cortés allegedly informed his emissaries, "for which the only known remedy is gold." The ambassadors reported this comment to Moctezuma, along with the astonishing fact that the newcomers rode on the backs of deer, horses. The superstitious Moctezuma also believed that Cortés was the god Quetzalcoatl, whose return from the eastern sea was predicted in Aztec legends. Expectant yet apprehensive, Moctezuma allowed the conquistadores to approach his capital unopposed. As the Spaniards entered the Valley of Mexico, the sight of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan amazed them. With 300,000 inhabitants spread over 10 square miles, it rivaled in size and pomp any city in contemporary Europe. The Aztec metropolis rose from an island in the center of a lake, surrounded by floating gardens of extraordinary beauty. It was connected to the mainland by a series of causeways and supplied with fresh water by an artfully designed aqueduct. Moctezuma treated Cortés hospitably at first, but soon the Spaniards' hunger for gold and power exhausted their welcome. They thirsted mightily for gold. They stuffed themselves with it. They starved for it. They lusted for it like pigs, said one Aztec. On the Noche Triste, sad night of June 30th, 1520, the Aztecs attacked, driving the Spanish down the causeways from Tenochtitlan in a frantic, bloody retreat. Cortes then laid siege to the city, and it capitulated on August 13th, 1521. That same year, a smallpox epidemic burned through the Valley of Mexico. The combination of conquest and disease took a grisly toll. The Aztec Empire gave way to 3 centuries of Spanish rule. The temples of Tenochtitlan were destroyed to make way for the Christian cathedrals of Mexico City, built on the site of the ruined Indian capital. And the native population of Mexico, winnowed mercilessly by the invaders' disease, shrank from some 20 million to 2 million people in less than a century. Shortly thereafter, in South America, the iron-fisted conquistador Francisco Pizarro crushed the Incas of Peru in 1532 and added a huge hoard of booty to Spanish coffers. By 1600, Spain was swimming in New World silver, mostly from the fabulously rich mines at Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, as well as from Mexico. This flood of precious metal touched off a price revolution in Europe that increased consumer costs by as much as 500% in the 100 years after the mid-16th century. Some scholars see in this ballooning European money supply the fuel that led the growth of the economic system known as capitalism. Certainly, New World bullion helped transform the world economy. It filled the vaults of bankers from Spain to Italy, laying the foundations of the modern banking system. It clinked in the purses of merchants in France and Holland, stimulating the spread of commerce and manufacturing. And it paid for much of the burgeoning international trade with Asia, whose sellers had little use for any European good except silver. Yet the invaders brought more than conquest and death. They brought crops and animals, language and laws, customs and religion, all of which proved adaptable to the peoples of the Americas, especially in Mexico. They intermarried with the surviving Indians, creating a distinctive culture of mestizos, people of mixed Indian and European heritage. To this day, Mexico remains a unique blend of the old world and the new, producing both ambivalence and pride among its people. Cortez's translator, Malinche, for example, has given her name to the Mexican language in the word Malinchista, or traitor. But Mexicans also celebrate Columbus Day as the Dia de la Raza, the birthday of a wholly new race of people. In the service of God, as well as in search of gold and glory, Spanish conquistadores, conquerors, continued to fan out across the New World and beyond. On Spain's long roster of notable deeds, 2 spectacular exploits must be headlined. Vasco Núñez Balboa, hailed as a European discoverer of the Pacific Ocean, waded into the foaming waves off Panama in 1513 and boldly claimed for his king all the lands washed by that sea. Ferdinand Magellan started from Spain in 1519 with 5 tiny ships. After beating through the storm-lashed strait off the tip of South America that still bears his name, he was slain by the inhabitants of the Philippines. His one remaining vessel creaked home in 1522, completing the first circumnavigation of the globe. Other ambitious Spaniards ventured into North America. In 1513 and 1521, Juan Ponce de Leon explored Florida, which he at first thought was an island. Seeking gold, and probably not the mythical fountain of youth, he instead met with death by an Indian arrow. In 1540 to 1542, Francisco Coronado, in quest of fabled golden cities that turned out to be adobe pueblos, wandered with a clanking cavalcade through Arizona and New Mexico, penetrating as far east as Kansas. En route, his expedition discovered 2 awesome natural wonders, the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River and enormous herds of buffalo, bison. Hernando de Soto, with 600 armored men, undertook a fantastic gold-seeking expedition during 1539 to 1542. Floundering through marshes and pine barrens from Florida westward, he discovered and crossed the majestic Mississippi River just north of its junction with the Arkansas River. After brutally mistreating the Indians with iron collars and fierce dogs, he at length died of fever and wounds. His troops secretly disposed of his remains at night in the Mississippi, lest the Indians exhume and abuse their abuser's corpse. Spain's colonial empire grew swiftly and impressively. Within about half a century of Columbus's landfall, hundreds of Spanish cities and towns flourished in the Americas, especially in the great silver-producing centers of Peru and Mexico. Some 160,000 Spaniards, mostly men, had subjugated millions of Indians. Majestic cathedrals dotted the land. Printing presses turned out books, and scholars founded distinguished universities, including those at Mexico City and Lima, Peru, both established in 1551, 85 years before Harvard, the first college established in the English colonies. But how secure were these imperial possessions? Other powers were already sniffing around the edges of the Spanish domain, eager to bite off their share of the promised wealth of these new lands. The upstart English sent Giovanni Caboto, known in English as John Cabot, to explore the northeastern coast of North America in 1497 and 1498. The French king dispatched another Italian mariner, Giovanni de Verrazzano, to probe the eastern seaboard in 1524. 10 years later, the Frenchman Jacques Cartier journeyed hundreds of miles up the St. Lawrence River. To safeguard the northern periphery of their New World domain against such encroachments and to convert more Indian souls to Christianity, the Spanish began to fortify and settle their North American borderlands. In a move to block French ambition and to protect the sea lanes to the Caribbean, the Spanish erected a fortress at St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565, thus founding the oldest continually inhabited European settlement in the future United States. In Mexico, the tales of Coronado's expedition of the 1540s to the upper Rio Grande and Colorado River regions continued to beckon the conquistadores northward. A dust-begrimed expeditionary column with 83 rumbling wagons and hundreds of grumbling men traversed the bare Sonora Desert from Mexico into the Rio Grande Valley in 1598. Led by Don Juan de Oñate, the Spaniards cruelly abused the Pueblo peoples they encountered. In the Battle of Acoma in 1599, the victorious Spanish severed 1 foot of each surviving Indian. They proclaimed the area to be the province of New Mexico in 1609 and founded its capital at Santa Fe the following year. The Spanish settlers in New Mexico found a few furs and precious little gold, but they did discover a wealth of souls to be harvested for the Christian religion. The Roman Catholic mission became the central institution in colonial New Mexico until the missionaries' efforts to suppress native religious customs provoked an Indian uprising called Pope's Rebellion in 1680. The Pueblo rebels destroyed every Catholic church in the province and killed a score of priests and hundreds of Spanish settlers. In a reversal of Cortez's treatment of the Aztec temples, more than a century earlier, the Indians rebuilt a kiva, or ceremonial religious chamber, on the ruins of the Spanish plaza at Santa Fe. It took nearly half a century for the Spanish fully to reclaim New Mexico from the insurrectionary Indians. Meanwhile, as a further hedge against the ever-threatening French, who had sent an expedition under Robert de la Salle down the Mississippi River in the 1680s, the Spanish began around 1716 to establish settlements in Texas. Some refugees from the Pueblo uprising trickled into Texas, and a few missions were established there, including the one at San Antonio, later known as the Alamo. But for at least another century, the Spanish presence remained weak in this distant northeastern outpost of Spain's Mexican Empire. To the west, in California, no serious foreign threat loomed, and Spain directed its attention there only belatedly. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo had explored the California coast in 1542, but he failed to find San Francisco Bay or anything else of much interest. For some 2 centuries thereafter, California slumbered undisturbed by European intruders. Then, in 1769, Spanish missionaries, led by Father Junipero Serra, founded at San Diego the first of a chain of 21 missions that wound up the coast as far as Sonoma, north of San Francisco Bay. Father Serra's brown-robed Franciscan friars toiled with zealous devotion to Christianize the 300,000 native Californians. They gathered the semi-nomadic Indians into fortified missions and taught them horticulture and basic crafts. These mission Indians did adopt Christianity, but they also lost contact with their native cultures and often lost their lives as well, as the white man's diseases doomed these biologically vulnerable peoples. The misdeeds of the Spanish in the New World obscured their substantial achievements and helped give birth to the Black Legend. This false concept held that the conquerors merely tortured and butchered the Indians, killing for Christ, stole their gold, infected them with smallpox, and left little but misery behind. The Spanish invaders did indeed kill, enslave, and infect countless natives, but they also erected a colossal empire, sprawling from California and Florida to Tierra del Fuego. They grafted their culture, laws, religion, and language onto a wide array of native societies, laying the foundations for a score of Spanish-speaking nations. Clearly, the Spaniards, who had more than a century's head start over the English, were genuine empire builders and cultural innovators in the New World. As compared with their Anglo-Saxon rivals, their colonial establishment was larger and richer, and it was destined to endure more than a quarter of a century longer. And in the last analysis, the Spanish paid the Native Americans the high compliment of fusing with them through marriage and incorporating indigenous culture into their own, rather than shunning and eventually isolating the Indians as their English adversaries would do.